Today's presentation will be given by Will Thompson, postdoctoral fellow of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies. Dr. Thompson is a socio-cultural anthropologist, and his research investigates relations of design and labor through China's contemporary building sites where projects of global capital, labor migration, and architecture converge. His current book project expands on 2 years of intensive fieldwork with rural construction workers on sites in the city of Xi'an, in local design studios, and through extended visits to workers' homes, village in Qinling Mountains in Shanxi province. Before turning to anthropology, he worked for 7 years in journalism and media, including 5 years at WBUR Public Radio in Boston. Today, he will be speaking on building on dreams, Chinese construction workers, rural-urban development, and the making of masculinity. Please join me in welcoming him.
Sorry. Hi. Thank you to Par for the introduction, and I wanted to say thank you all for coming, and also for this opportunity this year as a postdoctoral fellow to get to know everyone at the center. It's been a great experience so far, and I'm really glad to be able to present some of the work here today, which I hope will sort of spur some conversations throughout the year that I'm here. What I'm presenting here today is based on some new writing that I'm working on for an article in Gender Dynamics in Construction and Urban Development for an upcoming issue of Women's Studies Quarterly on Precarious Labor. It's still in a bit of progress, so I figured I would try out some of the angles and ideas and hope for some feedback, and I'd love to hear what people's suggestions are. And I'll also give a little bit of background and widen the scope of how this fits more generally within the project as a whole. So I'm sure everyone in this audience is probably somehow familiar with a Chinese construction site, but often with talking with people who don't know China very well, I find that I also often have to address some misconceptions they have about what constitutes a construction worker, what the type of subject position is. And I think the differences are pretty telling about the different forms of working class masculinity. So the American construction worker icon is kind of an image that is familiar in movies and popular culture. The construction worker often is a form of crude masculinity, over-determined as a stereotype, reflecting the ambivalence of both predatory and eroticized, and called sort of the archetypical proletarian. And indeed, the construction worker as a commodity, village people appropriately, is reflected in the fetish of the hard hat itself, which has, one writer said, has become the central symbol of American labor, with qualities of a magical object conferring masculinity on its wearer. The Chinese construction worker today, by comparison, is more often imagined like this: a poor, rural person, vulnerable, downtrodden, eking out a difficult existence on the margins of the urban world. Here's an image that became famous online that interpreted these men as refusing to sit because they were afraid that they would make the subway dirty. And this is obviously also a huge change from the figure of the socialist construction worker, who, as a symbol, if not always in lived reality, was also the archetypical socialist proletarian, and important to the political symbolism of the country. So I want to start with a question, which is what accounts for the differences between these two contrasting images? Do we ground the difference in a different cultural conception and performance of masculinity, or do we interpret it as a question of structural position that reflects a disempowered working class? Obviously, both of these are reductive explanations that end up making a caricature of the complex dynamic of political and cultural life. And so instead, I want to propose understanding the construction worker in a way that considers the material conditions that these images are based on, how they relate to the structural systems in place, both economic and gendered systems, and how they establish foundations for different types of possible citizenship. But in fact, the American construction workers' masculinity itself was a construct of the middle 20th century. Earlier building tradesmen engaged in different concepts of manhood altogether. The crude construction worker image that's seen verbally and physically objectifying, denigrating women emerged at the same time the traditional craft trade was under siege of deskilling and that industrial divisions of labor were being established, including, ironically, mechanization that made craft and as well as actual physical strength even less important for the work of construction. And indeed today, the macho worker is often understood as a beleaguered defense, the last gasp of working class white male privilege in the face of structural economic changes to manual labor. So historicizing the American construction worker lets us think about ways to also think about this point in history in which the idea of Chinese working class masculinity is being formed. And to think about it as not at all innate, but either to biological nature or to national culture, and to understand how within an emerging post-socialist capitalist market that masculinity operates as a resource for urban development. My work concentrates on a construction site as a social location in the city, and I'll start by detailing how the workers have become public symbols in China, and then move to the actual workplace itself as it's experienced by workers, which draws on participant observation on construction sites in Xi'an. And finally, I will explore the experiences of men who are working in these novel conditions and what types of symbols of masculinity and the building trade that they're creating. Foreign attention to migrant conditions of labor has largely focused on manufacturing workers. Scholarly and popular work alike focus on sweatshops that produce consumer goods for global export. As factories are sites that are highly feminized and sex-segregated in production, gender has emerged as one central theme in thinking about the experiences in manufacturing and of the changing place of women migrant workers in the post-socialist labor market. However, the parallel gendered work site of construction has garnered relatively little attention. Why this should be so is partly due to the outcomes of social proximity. Individual consumption entangles and implicates global consumers through intimate and embodies experiences with objects of purchase, possession, and use of these Chinese factory-made commodities. Material circulation mediates the world's connection to the Chinese labor force. So by tying famous brands like Apple and Nike to the conditions of labor, several generations of anti-sweatshop activists have been able to mobilize this personal connection we have with objects and through those to the Chinese worker. For the domestic Chinese audience, however, I contend it's men working in construction that are the most operative salient symbols of rural migrant labor, such that they've become synonymous in the popular imagination with the category of migrant labor of Minggong. And there's some reasons for this that are very particular about the kind of place a construction site is. Oh. Go back, sorry. And that has to do with the situation of the construction site in the city itself. These places, unlike manufacturing, cannot be pushed to the fringes of the city. Construction, by its nature, has to be performed in the middle of the city. Also, the work itself, the work process itself, it can't be put behind factory walls. It has to be performed out in public. And what this has done is made the construction site a very poignant place of class encounter between the emerging Chinese middle class and migrant laborers. So while the American consumer might know the Chinese labor indirectly through an object, the Chinese middle class see men working in public on construction sites on a kind of daily basis. And moreover, because of the scale of national construction, this has become so widespread as to be a sort of ubiquitous symbol in cities across China. And so one of the outcomes I want to argue is that construction has also become important as a cultural symbol. So there's the actual manual labor process, but you also within art, within popular culture, the construction worker is a very important figure, which you see in advertisements. This by Han Bing, performance artist. In Xu Bing's Phoenix, taking up pieces from the construction site. Wang Qingsong's Skyscraper. Parody band of contractors, and on the New Year's extravaganza of Chunwan. So in order to go on the site, taking up a role as a construction worker was not my original intention. I spent the first months that I was there with architects going to design studios, visiting projects under construction and trying to find ways through a formal system to get onto a construction site. After close to 6 months, however, of failing to gain a foothold on the sites, I realized that these formal institutional ways of getting onto a site wouldn't afford the kind of long-term engagement that I was looking for. There are numerous examples of researchers working in manufacture. However, I assume that my racial difference would mark me conspicuously foreign and preclude this kind of work. So, as it happened, a Bagonto, a labor boss, brought me onto the site. And in doing so, how I understand, it was through the same way that labor has no direct relationship to the workers they hire, or rather the contracting companies have no direct employment relationship to the men they hire. Also, I was able to come in through this black box that to management, labor is relatively invisible, and thus I was able to be invisible on site as well. So despite my incredulity, I was invited by the labor boss to join the crew and be one of his workers. And as I expected, my presence was almost instantly contested by a supervisor on site who represented the largest state-owned contracting company in the province. As it worked out, I was allowed to stay and remain there for 3 months, between April and June 2011. The crew's work was to install steel frames on a siding of a 20-story luxury loft project. The frames attached to the concrete outer wall of the building, which was reached by a swing stage scaffold, colloquially known as English as a window washing cart, painted orange and with platform and guardrails. The frames were then going to support a final skin of aluminum plastic composite that would cover over the concrete. The men working on the crew mostly came from the county of Jiashui in the Qingling Mountains in the southern part of the province. The crew shared a dorm room with 3 beds, 2 workers to each a piece to a bed. The crew was anchored by the Chung family, who come together, a large family by Chinese standards with 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter. The eldest and youngest, 22 and 16, worked with their father, who everyone called Old Chung. The daughter worked in a chain hot pot restaurant downtown, and the second son was launching an interior contracting company with cousins who had invested in it. Their mother, May, cooked all the meals for the family and for the extended crew each day in the rented dorm accommodations. Chun's wife and daughter lived in a separate room across a courtyard inside the same building, and the middle son occasionally returned to stay as well, along with a rotating cast of other workers who came and went depending on the availability of work on the site. The people coming to the site were not directly hired by the contractors, but brought through the labor contractors, the baogongtou. And in doing, and they either knew him from village ties or they knew other workers. The project itself eventually looked, or I guess this is before the project ever got built, it looked like this, and then at the end it looked like this. But then when I was there, it was really just a hulking concrete towers that stretched out in a sort of monotone gray wall. So now I want to talk about the dangers of construction. One of the issues about construction that has received a lot of talk in Chinese media has been the wages. And there's been a lot of anxiety, especially among college-educated people, that the wages of construction workers have exceeded those of new graduates. One of the issues that I think this points to is how it's not as simple as understanding the wage level as an absolute, but the overall conditions under which they work. And that's what I'll sort of turn to now. The work involved very little heavy exertion, but it was tedious and repetitive, belying the small hazards that accrete over time from physical work in a rough environment. So even without levels of physical exhaustion, the circumstances presented discomfort and dangers of the body through fatigue. Once up on the cart, a shift could last as long as 5 hours without coming down. So even in the summer, it was better to stay parched than find yourself stranded a dozen stories up in need of a bathroom. No one wore hearing protection, goggles, or gloves. The constant screech of the concrete left my ears ringing. Hands snagged on bled on sharp metal. And old Chung, when drilling in the concrete, would grimace and squint away from the grit that threw out from the wall, occasionally stopping to fish a speck of rock dust from his eyes. Safety was instituted through enforcement rather than training. Safety inspectors patrolled the site with clipboards and binoculars, noting violations and penalizing the subcontractors who were responsible for those workers that they found in violation. And often it was the optics of caution that took precedence over practical safety concerns. Large character red banners hung prominently on structures along the construction fencing with messages like, "Our core concern is people, safety first. Everybody is responsible." Most visible from off of the site, they designated a compliant construction site to an urban audience. The operative symbol of safety on site was the construction helmet. The color of the hard hat corresponded roughly to the positions on site, with workers on the ground mixing concrete or shoveling generally wearing red, and supervising managers and inspectors with white or blue helmets. Our crew wore yellow helmets that denoted a high elevation work on the side of the building, a color that was especially visible from a distance. On one occasion when I visited an architecture studio directly from the construction site, a Chinese architect friend asked to see my hat, and turning it around in his hand, rapped on it with his knuckles and said, "You know, this is not a hard hat, this is a prop." And then, turning serious, explained that anything falling would go straight through it. Most alarming, on numerous occasions each week, I witnessed members of the crew unfasten their safety harnesses from the lifeline that protected them from falls. The safety managers on site generally blamed workers' low education for safety violations, for putting themselves at risk. And I heard on repeated occasions the assertion that migrants had a lack of respect for their own lives. Wearing the safety harness was mandatory, but in practice it was not possible to complete the work within the constricted range of the harness. Old Chung, one of his sons, or another worker would then unhook themselves, crawl along the narrow building ledge to finish the work as required. While the equipment was inadequate to cover the scope of the work, the only option would have been to point out the problem, request the entire cart be repositioned to reach a few bolts, and then having it to move back again. It was a tacit understanding that the work needed to be done quickly, and since the management had provided and arranged the equipment, making it an issue would have likely met with frustrations by management. And actually, as cautious and risk-averse as I was, at one time there was a motor malfunction on the cart, and I had to take off the harness in order to get through a window, which afterwards they teased me about for being so scared of. And for me, this illustrated that this was probably one of the few times in my life that I was put in any sort of physically precarious position. But for them, it was an unremarkable occasion, like many that they constantly faced every day and shrugged off on a regular basis. So as the construction site is physically precarious, it was also economically so. Public concern in recent years has grown around the question of socioeconomic disparity, including rural-urban gap of wages and wealth. In particular, Chinese rural migrants have been described in political discourse with the term 弱势群体, vulnerable groups. The term originated as a term of art in international aid communities and human rights advocates. And in those circles, it's mostly accompanied by vulnerable groups like women and children. So it's notable that in China it came to describe the young heterosexual male members of a rural majority population who were the epitome of social vulnerability. And this, I think, also reflects another aspects of the state's interest in addressing vulnerable groups, which the stated goal is not simply addressing social inequity as an end in itself, but also as a means to maintain social stability. I'll jump over some. The way that construction workers were kind of formed into being this vulnerable group, I think, happened also through a very particular form of protest that was common, less so now, but reached its peak in the mid-2000s. The problem of stolen wages has been common in construction. And beginning in the 90s, the media began reporting on these problems of wage arrears, in which contractors would only pay at the end of the year in one lump sum. In recent years, there's been various means to prohibit the widespread practice, but they've not altogether eliminated the problem. So numerous protests erupted over wages each year as the Spring Festival approached, as workers were either not paid in full or in some instances when contract middlemen disappeared altogether. So in these repeated incidents, migrant workers took desperate measures, and particularly what came to be termed in media as the jumping show, where they would climb to the top of the buildings and threaten to jump. This was usually followed by high-stakes negotiations between managers and workers in front of police, firefighters, and a crowd of onlookers below. The threat of suicide dramatized the conditions of migrants' everyday social and economic vulnerability, concentrating their condition in a momentary spectacle of physical danger and suffering. It traded a slow violence, the slow creep of social injustice, into a single and condensed moment of public crisis demanding notice. So one of the questions is, what is it that motivates these men to come to cities? I think the question often gets alighted over by saying it's money. And certainly wages are the reason that they work, but what is it that forms the desires that those wages help achieve? For most migrant workers, 11 months of the year is spent in the cities saving and deferring as much spending as possible. For the majority of the year, the Chungs lived in the cheapest available accommodations they could find in Xi'an, paying around 250 yuan a month, less than the equivalent of $50 US, in an urban village across from the construction sites. The conditions were austere, far from the basic level most city residents would accept. With 6 to a room, there was no privacy. Across the courtyard balcony was a common sink to wash and a toilet for the entire floor of the apartment building. And basically, throughout the year, they spent no extra money that they could otherwise save. 11 months of the year, they generally ate almost no meat, drank no beer, only very occasionally buying a bottle of Sprite to celebrate an occasion. So So what is it that they were making in the cities during this time? The equivalent work on manufacturing, and especially looking at the figure of the dagongmei, the migrant rural woman, has focused on the ways that these factory jobs provide the opportunity for new kinds of urban subjectivity and positions to experiment with self-making. To be sure, they also understand the position of the factory worker as highly constrained and exploited along gender terms. But a lot of the work is also focused on this hope and also self-transformation. The young men that I talked to in construction rarely voiced any particular aspirations for becoming urban. One 23-year-old group leader on a site who had 30 people from his village working under him, and so was making a decent amount of money. He told me that his hometown was boring and he was considering not returning over the New Year. So when I asked him about his plans for the future and if he thought he would make his life in the city instead, he surprised me by saying, "No, it's impossible. Of course I'll go back." For many like him, the city was no place to make a life. And this is not to identify these desires as somehow a fundamental gender distinction, except insofar as the construction site and the factory were themselves defined by gender segregated work, and instead may reflect how different experiences in factory and construction promote different desires and mold different ambitions through the nature of the industry and the work itself. Probably, let's see what the next slide is. So while they were on the construction site, deferring all spending, they were also creating projects that were deeply invested in their hometowns. And it's my contention that one of the ways that their ambitions were directed to this were through the traditional privileges of masculinity, in which patrilocal and patrilineal ties gave them a place in a way that women have traditionally and famously not belonged to their natal villages. And so while this was incredibly meaningful to many of them, it also operated as a constraint because of the nature of the village and the nature of villages in general in China at the moment. Set in the Qingling Mountains that separate North and South Shanxi, the Chung's village was among the most poor in the province. Once it had been 13 hours drive from Xi'an, but new tunnels made it now only about 3 hours. However, as close as it was, they would still only come back for very particular times, mostly Spring Festival, also at times to build a tomb for the father. The first time I had met the Chungs, old Chung had invited me back to the village for Spring Festival, which was surprising to me because it had just passed. It was probably a couple weeks before. So I wasn't sure what that meant. What I came to understand is that this was an expression of his identification with the village, and that while he had the intention, there was really no ability for him to be a host in the temporary quarters that he had in the city. And so that invitation was also a deferral into the future in which he could properly be a host. Historically, China's mountainous areas had always been places of hard life under the constant shadow of famine. With labor-intensive farming on terraces carved in the steep sides of hills and marginal land that couldn't grow wheat or rice, the village had previously subsisted mostly on potatoes and corn. Now most of the farmland was left fallow, and this land could no longer provide for the villagers. So one of the aspects is that the way that the relationship between urban and rural production has been seen often in the literature has been that the villages provide a kind of subsidy to the city work of taking care of the reproductive work, also subsidizing by contributing food. That wasn't possible here. And so in a certain way, this place really operated as a projection screen for them to place their desires and ambitions. So on the first day of Spring Festival, the family rolled out strings of red firecrackers. The son hung duilian, the matched couplets of red paper, by the door, rituals for good luck, prosperity, to ward off ill over the coming year. Back at the rented apartment that they would stay in for the next 11 months, there were no such rituals or adornments for luck. Another day over the 3 weeks I was traveling there, the son returned from the market with a brand new washing machine in the back of a motorized three-wheel cart. It was an expensive present for his mother, and he said it was to help her. So I wondered if she would be staying in the village, but instead the machine sat in the main hall of the empty house, never hooked up over the whole year. Once they returned to the city, his mother continued doing the family's laundry by hand in a pan. Like their work, it gestured towards a deferred future, a down payment on a better life to come, rather than realizing any labor-saving purpose in the present. In some ways, the holiday itself was an instantiation of this, a temporary instantiation of this deferred future. It was where everyone came back and enacted for a brief time everything that they were working towards. And in that way, it also enrolled them into continuing the project of believing in that future. However, the question of whether that village would actually ever be able to provide them the kind of basis for that future is dubious, and suggesting maybe that the kind of future that they were building would be in a state of kind of perpetual deferral. Especially as their various projects continued to hit failure that seemed to be structured as much as it was accidental. So I'll say a few of the concluding sort of ways that I try to read some of this. One is to think about the nature of the relationship between these patriarchal privileges and the system of capitalism. A lot of times there's a tendency to flatten out discussions about intersectionality of gender and other categories as if privilege operates as an additive process. And in this, what I wanted to do was to look at how, in fact, there are many ways in which even the presumed privileges that come with being a first son are also then enrolled in the larger projects that entail their own exploitation, keeping them invested in places that can't return, keeping them invested in an imagination of life that was also perhaps appropriate for several generations before, but that the new conditions and requirements of urban work would really preclude them, and keep them in the cycle of constantly working towards a future that, for a number of reasons, would never come. So I'll stop there and then ask for questions.
Hi, my name's Jeff Kraczynski. So what about the next generation getting married and having kids? What would happen to them?
Yeah, and that's where I think that the flat view of kind of rural as a single category or male as a single category fails, because there's some rural people who will be fine, and there are some who won't, and the actual ways in which that gets decided is really through a lived process, rather than the sort of blocky identity demographic categories. So with maybe 30 million extra men over women, the stakes are very high. And even in this, what should seem like one of the most individual ambitions, which is getting married, it was always phrased as a duty and a pressure. Definitely one that they were also invested in, but one that caused a good deal of anxiety too. So with that gender demographic imbalance, one of the requirements for getting married is often said to be a house and a car. And one of the things that the younger son said to me about this was, a house? Well, we've got a house. Clearly an urban house and a rural house is very different, and the sort of how attractive coming to live for exactly the same gendered traditional reasons in a rural village would be, makes the investment that they put into renovating these houses one that has questionable returns. None of them have gotten married, although the daughter is, even though she's the third child, she was the first to get engaged.
Capitalism is clearly the context in which these relationships are formed and subjectivities are created, but I wonder if we could put it to the side for a moment, because it tends to kind of overshadow the historicity of some of these relationships as well. I am struck in your presentation by a lot of things that resonate with the socialist period and the Mao period, the sort of notion that people are self-sacrificing and working towards a future that may never come for them, but possibly for their children in the construction of socialism or communism. The idea that through labor they're able to transform their subjectivity and create new people. And then there's also this, in the propaganda that was offered by the state, this very sort of masculinized idea of the Chinese proletarian worker who's building factories, making steel, transforming the nation. And so I'm wondering if you can connect the things that you saw in Xi'an to this earlier period that might make it somewhat independent of the capitalist context and grounded in the place and the history of that place.
I think absolutely there was an ethic of sacrifice where I would see a difference in the socialist sacrifice that was acknowledged by the state, and theirs was a private, that everything was on behalf of something else. They were never saying they were building China. It was, they were sacrificing present consumption for future enjoyment. They were sacrificing on behalf of a brother to put him through school, on behalf of a future for their family. So on the one hand, this sacrifice that the socialist state promised and acknowledged and celebrated was allowed for an incorporation into the state that exceeded the wage. If you look at Ayn Rand, has an absolute antipathy to sacrifice. And I think within capitalist justification of the wage contract, there's no ability to acknowledge a sacrifice. Everything is contained in the contract. Anything that exceeds it is profane. So where I think this older historical consciousness comes in is actually within urban people's concern for the worker. If you compare construction workers in India with construction workers in China, India, they are also equally visible. They're equally present in the city. And that's seen as a problem. And there's not this mobilization of middle-class concern around the conditions of work for construction workers, certainly to the extent as China. And so I think that's a way in which China's really very much substantively post-socialist and not just capitalist. But I think increasingly sacrifice is a transitive verb. People are sacrificed. And that's a kind of technocratic decision as opposed to something in which they're considered a part of the agency of the state or of the nation. Sorry. Yeah. And I think that's an important point too, is that that there's a way in which also specifically gender divided studies, and I probably reproduce that problem here as well, tend to imagine two separate groups as opposed to people whose life projects are really tied together. There was, and I think that's one thing that this could also do better, is to understand gender relationally rather than simply the experience of men. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you have perceived any differences between different age groups. Just that audience mentioned that actually this is a very age diverse group. The construction work is very from like 20, early 20 to like 60. So there should be some differences in terms of how ambition and desire between the different age groups. Because back in China, a lot of media and scholars are talking about the first generation migrant workers. They kind of want to, go back to their hometown. They feel that's their root. But the younger generation, like those born in 1980s and 1990s, they're kind of very trapped. They cannot stay in the city because of the high living costs, but they cannot go back either because there is nothing there for them. So
Yeah,
that's
no, that's an excellent point and a great way to frame it, which is that also I think there's a lot of writing that sees they are optimistic, and they're driven by those optimisms and that desire and those ambitions about their life, and that has to do partly with their point in the life cycle as well, where so much is possible, or seemingly so. And so I think that's definitely a way to, what I'm trying to do in this also though is to see, to kind of respond to some of that talk about the new generation of construction work, or new generation of migrant workers that's often been interpreted very optimistically, and to show the ways in which those choices that they have before them are very highly constrained.
What is the formal education level of a typical construction worker, and what does it consist of? And is there such a thing as funded retirement from this kind of work?
And that's the big problem. Pensions in rural areas, there's all sorts of schemes to try to make them, but there aren't any generally for them. So, for instance, in the family of had 4 children, that was their way of addressing that problem, or they thought so. I think it was a way that in some ways backfired by spreading out family resources and making them, among their own very poor village, some of the poorest people in it. So the education level, the second son had not gone to high school. He went to the second year of which is junior high school, sort of 7th grade. His father would have maybe had little if none, and couldn't speak Mandarin. Spoke in the Shannan dialect. His children had all had some amount of education, probably through 7th grade, and that was pretty consistent with what I saw. Construction work is not something that rural people with any other choices would choose to do. It's the thing that, in fact, it's not considered, it's considered almost de-skilled by default. And that has to do also with how the labor is brought. People don't have their own credentials, but are vouched for by the work contractor, and so have very little flexibility. And so if people have anything else to do, they will do that. Construction work is in some ways just what men can do with their bodies in physical labor if they have no other options. She was engaged to a man who was also rural, but considered to be from a better city, or rather a better village. And that's kind of where that demographic has tendencies. As marriage becomes more of a rational choice and an intergenerational proposal, there's a lot of calculation as to that being part of a class transformation project. And because of 30 million more men, there's just a tendency for the poorest of the men to be marginalized by that absolute number. Right?
Talk about the issue of land in the hometown in the house, but I'm wondering whether or not land ownership factors into thinking about leaving or staying, or whether they also kill their own land or if they can do that.
What was interesting was that this was such marginal land and so far away from pretty much anything. The discussions about land taking, there was no real need for this. And in that way, there was plenty of land to go around, but it had exceedingly little value, which didn't mean that they didn't invest all their money in it, building, rebuilding, making tiled concrete houses in place of the traditional wood daub. So when they did, no one pretty much tilled except for a few small gardens near the house. I did on one occasion go with them to harvest wheat. And this is again how the rural areas are not all the same, that there's huge disparities within them. The mother's sister lived in a flat area, not in the mountains. And there, pretty much all the wheat had been mechanized. There were still some places up on hills, but they were better hills than their houses. So the aunt allowed the Jungs to come and plant that field because no one else in the village wanted it. So we went back, and what was marginal land in this village was still better than any option that they had in their own. Yeah.
But in the village, the acceptable way of providing for your retirement or security was having 4 children, not any other kind of investment.
And in fact, the government is really relying on this. There are laws. To what extent they can actually be enforced is unclear. But this is where the family and the state also have a tie-in, because without the resources to care through social welfare systems, they need people to take care of their parents. And that's also with the one child changing the gender dynamics. It's not only men who take care of their parents anymore. And that's also an important thing for revaluing daughters that have been traditionally seen as not part of that care system.
This is fascinating, thank you. I had a question about, you talked quite a bit about the economic and physical precarity of what we see as a primarily capitalist system of creating these buildings, and then this path to locals, what we might term more traditional, shaping of the desires of how to be a man in that world. And I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about what you just mentioned, sort of state-sponsored social welfare, and to what extent that set of constraints figured into the way that their desires were shaped. So access to education or lack thereof, if they were to move to a city, access to health care, because of the way that locality is so important to citizens that has. And whether you saw that as important to them, or whether these other two poles of the pull of the local versus the impossibility of economically sustaining in the city were more important to them.
Certainly that ethic of sacrifice had to do with the necessity of sacrifice. And that when, for instance, the the second son, ran away from home at 16. And then his mother beat him about that because she was angry of him stopping school. But his reason was because he saw his father working too hard. And then he went to the city where his brother was in high school and contributed the fees and the so so in that case, there's where those intersect, is that if both could have gone comfortably to school, both would have. Another detail of this is their house in the village was kind of a stalled construction site itself. They had spent all their first wave of earnings in building a house for their grandfather, who then died. And then the money went to focusing on other projects of the contracting company that the son was trying to start, and then to some various other sort of family projects to improve their lot. And I think that's also, you see a lot of the older people in rural areas, for instance, May, the mother's father. In the village, he was elderly and kind of attended to by his children. And then he left and he worked on a construction site. And so there was a lot of people kind of don't get to retire, and you don't retire when you're old, you retire when you're infirm. Thank you so much.